Today we are going to wrap up our look at punishment, and we are going to, time willing, begin our look at choice matching and self-control. So what we're going to do before we dive into the new stuff is we're going to have a quick recap of some of the things that we've already seen with punishment. We're then going to finish up our look at the benefits of punishment. We've had a lot of negatives about using the punishment procedure to change behavior. Now we're going to take a look at a few of the benefits of using the punishment procedure. And then we're going to end our look at punishment with tips for its effective use. So if you do analyze the situation that you're in, and you do make the decision that punishment is a necessary contingency to use in order to change the behavior, how do you effectively use that punishment procedure? We'll take a look at that when we wrap up punishment. And then we're going to begin our look at self-control by basically introducing the idea of self-control and what is self-control specifically to a psychologist. So we all kind of have this idea of what self-control is all about. We're going to see that that intuition is reflected in the psychological definition, but we'll go into explicit terms of what that psychological definition actually is. All right, so we were looking at punishment. We were taking a look at the types of punishment. So we got positive punishment, where something, the behavior results in something being presented to the organism. That results in a decrease in the behavior. That's positive punishment. We have negative punishment. The behavior results in something being taken away from the organism. That results in a decrease in behavior. That is negative punishment. And as we saw, they had a bunch of problems with them associated with punishment, including the very dangerous problem number 7, where the punishment contingency, the use of punishment, is very often strongly reinforced. It's very often strongly negatively reinforced. And as we know, when you reinforce a behavior, the behavior gets more frequent and it gets stronger. And if you reinforce punishment, then the punishment will become more frequent and it'll get stronger. Basically, that punishment can get out of control. And as we saw, this is what oftentimes happens when somebody is implementing a positive punishment procedure, such as the beatings that the police did to Rodney King. That falls under the category of positive punishment. So Rodney King at that point was under a positive punishment contingency. His behavior resulted in the presentation of something, batons and boots. That behavior decreased, and that's classified as positive punishment. But positive punishment is dangerous because the punishers themselves, the people implementing the punishment contingency, they themselves are being negatively reinforced for implementing that punishment. So whatever behavior Rodney King was doing, once this punishment behavior occurred, that behavior was taken away, and that led to takeaway, which reinforced the behavior of the punishment, which leads to an increase in both the probability and severity of that punishment as well. So we saw how, once again, through reinforcement and shaping, police officers or people that implement punishment procedures can go way out of hand. So you see this with police officers, you'll see this with parents that don't set punishment limits on their disciplining of their children. And basically that's why, as you'll see, setting limits for punishment, is a very important part of its proper implementation. All right, so that's the recap. So let's now get into the benefits of punishment. So we definitely don't want to say, oh, well, punishment comes with a whole bunch of nasty side effects, which it does. So we're never going to use punishment. Sometimes it's good to use punishment. Sometimes it's beneficial to use punishment. There actually are benefits associated specifically with these punishment contingencies. We visited the first one last time. Let's just recap it briefly. Punishment can have a side effect sometimes where it actually leads to an increase in social behavior. So the person being punished has a sort of internal drive to then engage in more social behavior with the person that gave the punishment. So we often see this when children are punished. They can't wait to reconcile with the parent. They can't wait to indicate to their punisher that everything is okay, that they've received the lesson. And this leads to an increase, a natural kind of increase in our social behavior. And as we saw, this has potentially a origin in evolutionary mechanisms where in any species there's going to be combat, there's going to be rivalries, whether it's rams butting their heads, fighting over territory, whether it's any other organism fighting over territory, fighting over food, fighting over mates. Whatever they're competing against, they will compete with each other. And that competition is a punishment scenario. It's saying, if you want this territory, I'm going to, give you, I'm going to present my fist to your face, and hopefully your desire for this territory will decrease, the punishment contingency. Well, as we mentioned in evolutionary development, it would be horrible for a species to have a fight, and that fight ends with one of the species dead, and the other one so maimed and injured that it dies within a couple of days. That's not beneficial for the species as a whole to escape extinction. So what they do is they have these appeasement signals. They have appeasement behaviors where after a certain fight, a certain level of a fight, one of the organisms will engage in a very social behavior that says, look, you've won. I don't want any more part of this. The territory is yours. The food is yours. I'm going to escape with my health. You escape with your health. And we can go on and the species can survive. So those are those appeasement procedures. And really, in a lot of species, they've evolved and adapted to the point where they don't even actually fight anymore. So a lot of times in a species, they'll just try to make themselves look big. And they'll just do a display and they'll say, hey, I'm this big. And the other person will be like, hey, I'm this big. And the first person will say, well, you're bigger than me, so okay, and just back off. And that appeasement behavior is naturally triggered from punishment and can be used to increase that social behavior. So for example, if you're a teacher and you have a kid that's withdrawn, doesn't want to interact, maybe just doesn't want to engage with you, you could try to implement a punishment procedure, find an opportunity to do punishment contingency with them, in the hopes that that would increase their social behavior and give you an in to interacting with that particular student. All right, so that was benefit number one. Benefit number two, punishment sometimes actually results in an improvement of mood, not for the person giving the punishment, but counterintuitively for the person being punished, right? So this is, again, that sort of internal mechanism. This is just an automatic thing that occurs. And I'm sure we've all felt this when either with our friends or our significant others, we've done something to them, and we know that we've hurt them, and they just say, you know what, it's fine, right? So they're just like, you went too far in that argument, you know what, it's fine. And you're sitting there thinking to yourself, no, I don't feel good. Like, I want you to yell at me a little bit. Like, I need you to dole out some positive punishment my way because you don't feel good. And it's just a natural mechanism where if you get punished, you just have, again, that response where it can actually improve your mood. So it's almost like if you have a situation, again, where somebody has a depressed mood, or somebody has just for whatever reason, you know, a lower amount of mood, you might again look for an opportunity to implement a punishment procedure to just trigger that natural mechanism that we all have where we feel sometimes better when we have experienced that punishment protocol. All right, and benefit number 3, punishment can actually increase attention to the environment. So punishment can actually make you more aware of your environment. And sometimes it can have, so we'll talk about the positives first. So if you are, for example, a daydreamer, or you know somebody who is a daydreamer, and I will be the first to say a certain level of daydreaming I think is wonderful. I don't think you should be 100% focused on task at all times. I think a certain amount of mind wandering and allowing your mind to kind of go where it is a highly creative way to come up with really innovative solutions. But sometimes it can get to be too much. Like any behavior, it can get to be too much. So if you have a job and you need to produce, you know, these two people here are at risk of losing their job. So one way that you can naturally get them to pay more attention to the environment around them is to actually implement a punishment procedure. And individuals who are under a punishment contingency and have experienced punishment contingency, they become more aware of their surroundings. So if you're dealing with somebody who daydreams a lot, if you're dealing with somebody who is just naturally clumsy because they don't pay attention to where they're going, so if you have, you know, somebody who's like always walking around like this and they're falling over things and they're hurting themselves, if you're in a position to put them under a punishment contingency, that might naturally increase their attention to the environment. So I mentioned that there's a good side to this. There's also a bad side to this, and that comes in the form of bullying. So bullying is a form of punishment. It's a punishment contingency where the person being bullied does a behavior like sit in a seat or, heaven forbid, try to buy lunch with their lunch money, and then that behavior is being punished by the bully. But what you'll find is if you take a look at people who have been bullied, they are much more aware of their environment than other individuals typically would be. So they have, through that history of punishment, actually developed almost like a super sensitivity to their environment, where they will hear things in the hallway, they will notice cars that go by, they will be hyper aware of that because their day-to-day survival required them to know, you know, where their bullies are, make sure that they're aware when they walk into the room. And that's kind of the downside of this, but nevertheless, attention to the environment can be increased. So if that is something that the person that you're interacting with needs, one way to just naturally increase that is to look for opportunities to implement these punishment procedures. All right, any questions on the benefits of punishment? All right. So now let's take a look at the effective use of punishment. So let's say that you're in a situation and you've weighed the negative side effects of punishment and you've weighed the benefits of punishment, and you say to yourself, because of the nature of the behavior, and because of the pros and the cons of punishment, I've decided, yes, we're going to implement a punishment procedure. Now we need to know, how do you make that the most effective? So we'll take a look at, I believe, 7 tips on how to make it the most effective. Tip number 1, punishment should be immediate rather than delayed. So this is, again, that idea of temporal contiguity. The faster you can follow the behavior with the punishment, the more effective that punishment trial will be. So the more the behavior will decrease as a result of a single trial. So we saw this in the treatment of Harry. So as soon as Harry self-abused, Dr. Fox was like, take out the restraints. You know, we're going. We're leaving with your restraints. It wasn't that Harry self-abused and a minute later he was like, all right, well, let's take your restraints out because he self-abused. It was immediate. So because it was so immediate, those trials were maximally effective. And when he did the positive punishment of getting into Harry's face, he did it immediately. As soon as Harry got into his space, he looked at Harry, right? As soon as Harry got in, he looked at Harry. He didn't let Harry withdraw and then present his punishment. So immediate leads to more effective punishment. And this is actually, just to give you a personal example of this, this is something that we implemented with my daughter. So my daughter would receive timeout as a form of negative punishment. And one of the things that she did when she was a child is she drew on the walls. She is a wonderful artist, and we have her art on paper all over our house, all over our walls. But when she was younger, she would take her crayons or she would take her markers, and she would actually draw on the wall. And if we caught her drawing on the wall, then she got timeout, she got placed in her timeout chair. But oftentimes, you would just be walking around your house and you turn a corner and there was a new piece of art on the wall. And, she's the only child in the house at that time. So we knew it was her, but we didn't punish her for those trials. Because if it was done 20 minutes ago, we've missed our window. It's not going to be effective. We could put her in timeout and say, you're going in timeout, but it just wouldn't have been effective. So unless we caught her red-handed because of this tip, we wouldn't actually implement that punishment procedure. All right, tip number 2. This kind of goes contradictory to the first tip, and you can see that it's kind of a delicate balance. Which one do you prefer, or which one do you prioritize higher? Punishment should consistently follow each occurrence of the unwanted behavior. So punishment should not be placed on an intermittent schedule. So you remember we had those intermittent schedules of reinforcement, where we were going to reinforce every 10th, occurrence of the behavior, or we were going to reinforce on average every 10th occurrence of the behavior. Those led to highly effective and high rates of behavior for reinforcement. But when you're doing the opposite, when you're trying to suppress behavior, it needs to be done every single time. So punishment should consistently follow each occurrence of the unwanted behavior. And we saw this again in the treatment of Harry. He was never let off the hook. Not once when he self-abused did Dr. Fox say, you know what, we'll overlook that one. We'll pretend we didn't see that, or we'll give you a free pass on that. In order for the punishment to be maximally effective, it needs to be done every single time. And I mentioned that this kind of contradicts tip number 1, because you have to decide, am I going to go for temporal contiguity, where I punish them immediately, or if I missed it, am I going to sacrifice punishing them every single time? So the times when I didn't catch my daughter red-handed, when she drew on the wall, I had to make a decision. Is it better to not punish her because of the temporal contiguity is gone? Or is it better to punish her to maintain that punishing every single time she does a behavior? Clearly, it's best if you can catch them red-handed and do it every single time. But this is one of those sort of decisions that, like Dr. Fox mentions, sometimes you just got to do by the seat of your pants. Sometimes you just got to do it by almost an intuitive feeling of how much time has passed, or when would it be most beneficial, every single time or more higher temporal contiguity. All right, tip number 3 for effective use of punishment. And this one goes completely counter to our own intuitions of how to punish people, our own intuitions of justice and fairness, flies in the face of this tip here. And this is that your punishment should be intense enough for it to suppress the target behavior from the beginning. So it needs to be strong enough, the consequence needs to be big enough from the beginning in order to suppress the behavior. So for example, we saw Dr. Fox, when he was designing Harry's punishment procedures, he mentioned that he was going to have 3 levels of negative consequences. 3 levels of that punishment behavior. Sorry, 3 levels of intensity, let's say. So level number 1 was that 5-minute timeout. If Harry self-abused, restraints were taken away for 5 minutes, 5-minute timeout period, 5 minutes of negative punishment. If that was not effective, if Harry continued to self-abuse and the timeout procedure was not effective, Then they were going to move to full body restraint. So that was the second procedure. They were going to restrain his entire body. If that was ineffective, then level 3 would have been brief electric shock. So he had 3 levels of punishment, each one more intense than the last. And as we saw, the 5 minutes of timeout from restraints was effective. It was enough. It was strong enough at the outset to suppress Harry's behavior, and he never had to go beyond that 5-minute timeout condition. So he at one point says it was very gratifying that Harry was, doing the task to receive the restraints, and it was evident that we would not need to go beyond the level 1 contingency. So he had chosen a level that decreased the behavior from the outset. But let's say that he didn't choose the 5 minutes of timeout from the restraints. Let's say instead that level 1 was 1 minute timeout from the restraints. So you got level 1 being 1 minute of timeout from the restraints. You got level 2 now is 5 minutes of timeout. You got level 3, full body restraint. You got level 4, brief contingent electric shock. If that was the case, and level 1 was ineffective, if that 1 minute timeout condition was ineffective, what happens is that when you move to level 2, you run the risk of that now being ineffective. And if you start too low, you run the risk of actually shooting past the level that would have been effective if you started with it, and you get to, they might have had to have gone to the full body restraint. Or they might have had to have gone all the way up to brief contingent electric shocks. So this is one that is a little bit weird because it really flies in the face of what we kind of think is fair. Because usually, we have that idea in our society of, well, it's your first offense. We'll be lenient. It's like, oh, well, this is the first time that you did that. Let me just sort of, a very small little slap on the wrist. We actually have these phrases in our language. Oh, I'll just give you a slap on the wrist, it's your first time. That as a deterrent to behavior or as a way of decreasing the unwanted behavior is very ineffective. Not only is it ineffective, but it means that to get to a level that will eventually suppress behavior, you have to go higher than you would have if you started at a more intense level of timeout. So for example, when I was giving timeout to my daughter, if I started at, we did 30 seconds for however old she was. So when she was 3 years old, it was 1.5 minutes. When she was 4 years old, it was 2 minutes. But let's say, and 2 minutes was effective at 4 years of age. If, on the other hand, we started lower than that, if on the other hand, when she was 4, we said, all right, you're getting a timeout for 30 seconds, and that was ineffective, we might ramp that up to 1 minute. That would be ineffective. We'd ramp it up to 1.5 minutes. That would be ineffective. We'd ramp it up to 2 minutes. And because we started low, we would then have to ramp it up to 2.5, 3, 3.5, maybe all the way up to 4 minutes. So now we're punishing her for 4 minutes to suppress her behavior because we started too low. But if we had started at the 2 minute level, we could have punished, that would have been the effective level. So it's almost as if you learn to get punished and you then require more of an intense punishment in the end, and that's not what we want to do. We're not looking to intensely punish individuals. We're looking to suppress that behavior as gently, I guess would be the correct word, as possible. All right, tip number 4. Negative punishment is generally preferable to positive punishment. So negative punishment procedures just seem to work more effectively. They seem to lead to fewer of those negative side effects that we talked about before, and they're generally psychologically preferable than positive punishment. So you'll notice that the major form of punishment, again, that they used Harry when they were treating Harry was to use that timeout from restraints, that negative punishment. They didn't have positive punishment. They didn't scold him. They didn't get into his face at the beginning. The major form was that taking away of the restraints. And this is actually the reason, when psychologists discovered this is the reason why the timeout procedure replaced spanking as the sort of generally accepted way of disciplining children. So back in at least the 50s, spanking corporal punishment used to be the regular way of disciplining your child. And if you ask your grandparents or even your parents about how they were disciplined when they were children, chances are their dad took their belt off and they knew, oh my gosh, this is it. And they presented their belt to their bottom, and that was positive punishment. Psychologists discovered negative punishment is more effective. That's why timeout is now the preferred and most widely used method of corrective behavior, just because it is actually a better way of disciplining and changing that behavior, decreasing that negative behavior. All right, tip number 5. Punishment is more effective when it's accompanied by an explanation. So this is something that I want to make sure that we're not misunderstanding this. Punishment is more effective when it's followed by an explanation. That doesn't mean that it's not effective if it's not followed by an explanation. So clearly, an explanation requires language abilities, right? In order to explain why it was that you implemented a punishment procedure on somebody, in order to explain why somebody earned a punishment, clearly they have to be able to understand your language. So the fact that we can punish dogs to change their behaviors, the fact that we can punish rats, we can punish pigeons, and decrease their behaviors, means that it's not essential. However, we're trying to do this as effectively as we can, and if you follow punishment with an explanation, it makes the punishment more effective. So you can see this in Harry's treatment. If Dr. Fox never explained what he was doing, if as soon as Harry self-abused, Dr. Fox just took the restraints and wordlessly walked out of the room with them, Harry would have eventually learned that his behaviors are being resulted in this punishment contingency, his behaviors resulted in his restraints being taken away, and his self-injury would have decreased eventually. However, Dr. Fox was able to massively speed up that learning procedure by saying, because you didn't take off your restraints, we're leaving with your restraints, and saying things like, because you yourself, we're leaving with your restraints. He was given explanations. He was told why it was that he was being punished, and that led his trial to be way more effective, his learning to occur much more rapidly, and less punishment was required. And we'll pick up this idea again of an explanation when we take a look at rule-governed behavior, and we'll get into the intricacies of that and see how it has pros and it has cons as well. All right, tip number 6. Punishment of an inappropriate behavior should be combined with reinforcement of the appropriate behavior. So if you're going to punish a particular behavior, remember when we were taking a look at the side effects of the punishment, when you punish a behavior, all it does is suppress that behavior. It does not increase the opposite behavior. It does not increase the appropriate behavior. So if you're punishing foul language in your children, punishing foul language does not automatically increase politeness, right? You have to reinforce the other appropriate behavior. So punishment should always be combined with some sort of positive reinforcement for the appropriate behavior. And we saw this with Harry. So Harry was reinforced with pretzels and Cokes. Harry was reinforced with good job, well done. Harry was reinforced with, trips outdoors, going to the 7-Eleven store, getting himself some M&Ms. And this was done for the appropriate behaviors. Because if this wasn't implemented, Harry's self-abuse may have gone way down, but then none of his other appropriate behaviors, such as learning, such as listening to Dr. Fox, would have actually increased as well. And if you analyze it at its core, Harry's actual punishment was linked to a opposite reinforcement. So his punishment was, your restraints get taken away. That was the negative punishment procedure that they were on. His reinforcement was, if you do this task, this appropriate behavior, you get your restraints back. So it literally was the opposite, but that reinforcement procedure was placed in there. And this is something, again, that needs to be reminded, because our own sort of natural intuition, our own sort of natural tendencies, especially because of our human natures, is if we're punishing a behavior to get rid of it, we're almost just glad that the behavior is gone, right? We're almost just glad that the child or the individual has just decreased that behavior, because again, it's probably a behavior that took effort on our part to deal with. So when it's gone, all of a sudden we're like, oh, we have all this saved effort. As a clinician, as a psychologist, we then have to put that effort back into positively reinforcing the appropriate behaviors. So that's something, again, to be remembered when you're putting in punishment. Make sure that you've already planned in that appropriate reinforcement of appropriate behavior. So once again, when my daughter drew on the wall, she got timeout. She got a timeout procedure, but I did not want to suppress drawing. I knew that she loved art, and the last thing that I wanted her to do was to learn I'm not supposed to draw. So she got tons of reinforcement whenever she drew anything on paper. That's the appropriate response, and that's why if you ever come to our house, you will see it's literally covered with all of her artwork, and we're going to have to make some room for her brother's artwork because he's starting to get into it as well. All right, any questions on punishment in general, the tips that we took a look at here, and just any of the things that we've covered so far? All good? All right. So that is the end of our look at punishment. What we're going to do now is we're going to introduce self-control. It looks like this might be a little bit of a shorter class today, so if you're going to hopefully beat the winter storm on your way home, probably buy you an extra 15 minutes to do that. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to start our look at self-control, and we're going to start very basically by taking a look at the psychological definition for self-control. What is self-control? So again, we have this intuitive idea of what we mean by self-control. When we see somebody do a particular behavior, we can say things like, oh wow, they have a lot of self-control. When we see them do another behavior, we'll say things like, well, they don't have very much self-control whatsoever. So we know self-control when we see it, but how do we psychologically define self-control? So self-control is part of its overarching goal. The overarching goal of self-control is choosing the optimal pattern of behavior. So you have a lot of choices in terms of what behavior you're going to follow, and if you choose that optimal pattern of behavior, the one that gets you to your goals, the one that's the most beneficial to you, then we say, oh, you have self-control. So that's the kind of general idea. And this idea of self-control often involves the following choice. It often involves either choosing a larger, later reward instead of a smaller, sooner reward. Or, alternatively, it involves choosing a smaller, sooner punishment rather than a larger, later punishment. So most of failures of self-control can be understood in terms of choosing that smaller, sooner reward or opting for the larger, later punishment. Most instances of self-control can be seen as choosing that larger, later reward or choosing that smaller, sooner punishment. So most of the situations where we look at somebody and say, oh, they have a lot of self-control, is because they passed up a smaller, sooner reward in favor of a larger, later reward. And most of the instances where we say somebody lacks self-control is when they choose a smaller, sooner reward over a larger, later reward. So in that Katy Perry song, This is how we do. She has that one line about respect for everybody buying bottle service with their rent money. Does anybody know that lyric I'm talking about? She has this one shout out where she's like, shout out to everybody buying bottle service with your rent money. And every single time I hear that, I'm like, you are going to be homeless tomorrow, right? But that's an example. So nobody would look at them and say, oh my gosh, you're buying bottle service with your rent money? I wish I had your self-control. No, you look at that and you're saying, bottle service with your rent money, that's a smaller, sooner reward. Yeah, you're going to have a good time tonight, but that larger, later reward of having a house when the outside looks like that you've given up. You know, so it's that choice of smaller, sooner versus larger, later. So to give you another example of this, something that is a larger, later reward on a lot of our minds, in society in general, is the idea of health. So, where's my health? There we go. So the idea of health, the idea of being physically fit, the idea of having certain physical goals is for a lot of people their larger, later reward. So this is probably going to be on everybody's brain in about a month and a half when New Year's resolutions roll around. And I would imagine the number one New Year's resolution is to lose weight and to get fit. So that's a larger, later reward. It takes time, and it's a big reward. So what we have here is we have this larger, later reward. There we go. Achieving your fitness goals. And what makes this difficult is that you have a lot of smaller, sooner rewards, and these are coming up pretty soon as well, that impede your fitness goals. So we know that this is the larger reward, and we know that this is the smaller reward, because if you did the following thought experiment, right? So let's say that you were walking down the street and somebody comes up to you and there's a booth, right? And this person's on the up and up, and they have this magic booth. And they say to you, I'm going to give you one opportunity to enter this booth. And you have to make a choice. Before you enter my magical mystery booth here, I'm going to have to put it on one of two settings. In setting number one, whatever your fitness goals are, right? Whether you want to bulk up, whether you want to trim down, whether you want to lower your blood pressure, whatever it is what you want to do, whatever your fitness goal is, you're going to walk into that booth, and 1 minute later, you're going to pop out, fitness goal, done. You're going to have it. You're going to have that fitness goal you always wanted. That's option number one. Option number two is I'll set the machine on the second option. You walk in there, and a minute later, you walk out with a donut. Those are your two options. I cannot imagine anybody at that time saying, you know what? That healthy body sounds pretty good, but I'm going to have to go with that donut, right? Most people would not choose the donut. Most people would choose achieving their health goals. That's a larger reward. You would pick the larger reward. So why is it that we're facing a health crisis in our society? Why is it that a lot of people are not reaching their health goals? And programs like, I think it's Noom, is like the new one that's people are going crazy for. It's a new weight loss management program. Why are these billion-dollar industries? Well, the reason is because even though that's a larger reward, it's a later reward. And the other one is a smaller, sooner reward. And when you break down in terms of self-control, what happens is you have your larger, later reward, but for some reason, you choose the smaller, sooner reward. So you have this goal of having a fit body, but then you're at Thanksgiving dinner, and you have a smaller reward. There's that donut looking at you, but it's sooner. It's right there. Instead of being months away, it's right there. So it's a very much sooner reward. And then what happens is people choose this and forfeit this particular reward over here. So we're going to take a look at models in terms of why this occurs. Why is it that we make that psychological choice to take the smaller, sooner reward rather than the larger, later reward? And the small answer or the short answer for that, does anybody have an intuition of why it is? that we choose one or the other? Yep.
Is it like instant gratification?
Part of it is instant gratification. What is the sort of, what is the feature of instant gratification? It's kind of there in the name. All right, I'll give you another example of this. Smaller, sooner reward. Do you go back to when you were a child and and it was Christmas time, right? So right now, well, not right now, 2 weeks from now, right, after Thanksgiving, is Christmas time. And you're a child, and the tree goes up, and there's presents under the tree, and you see your name on one of the presents, right? And it's December 1st, and you see your name on one of the presents. How excited are you about receiving that present, right? Think about how excited you are on December 1st. Then a week goes by, right? It's December 8th. How excited are you to get that present? Then some more time goes by. All of a sudden, it's December 23rd, right? The night before Christmas. And all of a sudden, you're kind of like, oh my gosh, I wonder what that present is. Then it's December 24th, it's Christmas Eve, and you're like, oh my goodness, I wonder what that present is. And then if your parents let you, stay up at 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve, and you're like, oh, I can barely stand it. You go to bed, you can barely fall asleep. You're sleeping soundly the entire month of December. Now that it's close, now that you're close to receiving your reward, all of a sudden, that Christmas present is right on your mind. And then when you're having Christmas breakfast, before you open your gifts, it's all you can think about is what is that gift? Oh my gosh, what is it going to be? And then when your parents are like, okay, it's time to open our gifts, and they're like, no, not you. Let's do your little brother first. Then you're going bananas, right? Because you're so incredibly close. What happens to us, and the reason why instant gratification is so gratifying, is because when a reward is delivered, that's when it's worth the most to us. Psychologically, it's worth the most. So a donut is just a donut. And we have a certain amount of enjoyment. We have a certain amount of value that we will receive from that donut. And psychologically, the amount of value that we place on a donut, when the donut is in our hand, is way more than the value of that donut if we have to wait 30 minutes for it. So if I had a donut right here, in each of your hands, that donut would have more psychological value to you than if I said, you know what, at the end of this class, I got donuts for everybody. So a donut right now is worth so much more psychologically than a donut 30 minutes from now. And what happens, in essence, when we pick a smaller, sooner reward than a larger, later reward, we are optimizing our psychological value. We are saying, in this moment, right now, which one of these is worth more? And even though the smaller reward is technically smaller, that sooner part, as we're going to see, ramps up that reward. That sooner part makes it like that Christmas gift on Christmas morning, and you're just waiting and going bananas, trying to, waiting for your turn to open it. And what happens is that this together makes the reward value of this larger than this, because this is too far away. So what happens is that we always make the rational decision. We always make the decision where we're going to maximize our psychological value. It just so happens that our psychological value changes as a function of time. And the closer something is, the more value it has. That's why, just to give you one last example, in a lot of negotiations, monetary negotiations, especially back in the day, people loved cash. They hated checks, they hated credit cards, because if you go through check or credit card, you gotta wait like a week before you actually get that money. You got cash in hand, you got that reward right now. So people would give cash discounts, right? You could actually go to salesmen and say, how much is this car? And they would be like, well, that car's $10,000. And you'd be like, well, what if I pay cash? And they'll be like, okay, that's $9,000. We'll knock 10% off for cash. It's because cash is right there, right then. It's worth more psychologically. All right, so we're going to take a look at the ins and outs of that. Next time when we meet, it looks like we are going to wrap up a little bit earlier today. So keep this in mind. This is the general framework that we're going to take a look at for self-control. Next time we're going to put some graphs to it so we can understand what's going on in our minds. But once again, it doesn't matter if you fail at self-control. It doesn't matter if you succeed at self-control. It doesn't matter if you do a behavior where people look at you and say, wow, that person has no self-control. Or if you do a behavior where people say, wow, I wish I had that person's self-control. You're always making the choice of maximizing your values. So we're going to see that one way to increase so-called self-control is to somehow change those values, and we're going to see certain techniques to do that as well. All right, so that is it for today. So if that's all that you got today, drive safe out there, and I will see you all next time.